Gideon Ashworth, Duke of Ravensmere, had a rule he had never once broken in 5 years of holding his title. He did not fall in love with the women who worked in his house. He broke that rule in 11 months. Then, on a cold morning in his study, with his own mother watching from the doorway, he broke the heart of the woman he loved, to save her from a life she had never asked for. He told himself it was mercy. He told himself it was the only honorable thing a duke in his position could do. He believed it, right up until the day a letter arrived announcing that Miss Clara Whitfield, the governess he had cast out of his home, was being courted by a lord with a country house, a spotless name, and nothing standing between him and her heart. That was the day Gideon Ashworth learned that a man can survive giving away the thing he loves most, but he cannot survive watching someone else take it and call it theirs. This is the story of how he tried anyway. It begins earlier than that morning in the study. It begins with a girl of 24 stepping down from a hired carriage in front of a house so large she had to tilt her head back to see the top of it, clutching a single travel case that held everything she owned in the world, and a letter of introduction that was, in truth, the last respectable thing left to her family's name. Clara Whitfield did not come to Ravensmere Hall because she dreamed of dukes. She came because her father, a naval captain once decorated for bravery at sea, had been quietly ruined by a court-martial that stripped him of his rank over a decision that was never truly his fault, and because a family with a ruined name has very few doors left open to it. Governess was one of the few respectable positions available to a woman of good breeding and no fortune. Clara had taken it the way a person takes a rope thrown to them in deep water, gratefully, and without asking too many questions about who was holding the other end. She did not yet know that the man holding the other end of that rope was a duke who had buried his wife 3 years earlier, and buried, along with her, any belief that he was capable of making a woman happy. Gideon had not interviewed the governess himself. That task had fallen, as most domestic matters did, to his mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, a sharp-eyed woman who had raised one son to inherit a crumbling fortune and had grown very good at spotting people who might be useful to the family's survival. She liked Clara's steady voice, her modest dress, and the fact that she did not flinch when told the little girl she would be minding had not spoken a full sentence to a stranger in over a year. That little girl was Lady Sophia Ashworth, 5 years old, with her father's serious eyes and her late mother's habit of going very quiet when she was afraid. Sophia had been 2 when her mother died of a fever that swept through the county one wet autumn, and though she was too young to remember much of her mother directly, she remembered, in the vague way small children remember things, that the house had once been louder and warmer, and that her father used to laugh. Gideon did not laugh anymore, not because he had forgotten how, but because he had convinced himself that laughing again would somehow be a betrayal of his wife, of his daughter's grief, of the crushing weight of a title that came with debts he had not created, and a household that depended on him not to fail. His father had left the dukedom in worse condition than anyone in society suspected, and his younger brother's gambling losses, quietly settled twice before an early death of his own, had eaten further into what remained. Gideon carried all of it the way some men carry old injuries, silently, and with a limp only the people closest to him ever noticed. Clara noticed within her first month. She noticed it in the way he stood in doorways rather than entering rooms fully, as though he expected to be asked to leave. She noticed it in the way he watched his daughter from across the nursery, close enough to see her, too far to be reached by her small arms. And she noticed, though she told herself sternly not to dwell on it, the way his voice changed, softened, slowed, on the rare evenings he came to say goodnight to Sophia, and found Clara still there, reading by candlelight in a chair too big for the room. For most of that first year, nothing happened between them that could not have been described, quite truthfully, as friendship. Gideon began arriving earlier for those good nights. Clara began, without quite admitting it to herself, choosing which stories to read aloud based on whether they might make him smile. Sophia began speaking in full sentences again, first to Clara, then, slowly, to her father, and the sound of his daughter's laughter, a sound Gideon had feared he would never hear again, became, without his permission, tangled up entirely with the presence of the quiet, steady young woman who had brought it back. There was a dinner, in February of that first winter, that neither of them ever spoke of afterward, but neither of them ever forgot. a retired admiral, an old friend of the family, invited to discuss naval matters with Gideon over port, mentioned in passing a court-martial he had once sat on the edges of, a captain named Whitfield, he thought, though he could not quite recall the details, only that the man had been made rather a scapegoat for a decision that was never truly his to make. Clara, seated at the far end of the table in her position as governess brought down for the child's benefit, had gone very still over her soup, her knuckles white around her spoon, waiting for the moment her father's disgrace would be laid out for the whole table to examine like a stain on good linen. Gideon changed the subject before the admiral could say another word. It was such a small thing, a single sentence about the unusually mild weather, delivered smoothly enough that the admiral never noticed he had been redirected, that Clara almost missed it entirely. She did not miss the look Gideon gave her afterward, though, brief and private, and entirely unnecessary to explain. I saw, I understood. You are safe at this table. She excused herself shortly after, claiming Sophia needed putting to bed, and stood alone in the corridor outside the dining room for a long moment afterward, pressing the back of her hand to her mouth, undone by a kindness so quiet it would have been invisible to anyone not desperately, carefully guarding a family's last shred of dignity. She began, after that evening, to let herself trust him in small ways she had not permitted herself before. It was a dangerous kind of trust for a governess to extend toward the man who employed her, and she knew it even as she indulged it, the way a person standing at the edge of a cliff knows the ground is unstable and leans out to look at the view regardless. It would be 11 months before either of them said a true word about what was growing between them. It would take only one morning to end it, and it would take a letter from a lord neither of them had yet met to teach Gideon Ashworth that some mistakes cannot be undone with an apology, they can only be undone with a fight. To understand why a duke would give up the one woman who made his house feel like a home, you have to understand what was waiting for him in London that same spring, a cousin with empty pockets and a widow with a plan. Reginald Ashworth was 36 years old, handsome in the way that made older women trust him and younger women underestimate him, and he stood to inherit everything Gideon owned if Gideon died without a legitimate son. For most of his life this had been an abstract fact, the kind of thing distant cousins mention at dinner and forget by dessert. But Reginald had spent the last several years losing money at card tables he could not afford to sit at, and the moneylenders who had quietly extended him credit against his expectations as the future Duke of Ravensmere were beginning to ask, with increasing firmness, when those expectations might be realized. Reginald did not wish his cousin dead. He was not, whatever else might be said of him later, a man capable of that particular cruelty. What he wished, with a hunger that grew sharper every month his creditors grew bolder, was for Gideon to remain exactly as he was, unmarried, without a son, safely delaying the one outcome that would end Reginald's usefulness to the men he owed money. A duke with an heir was a duke Reginald's creditors would stop indulging. A duke who might marry again was a threat that needed managing. He could not stop Gideon from marrying, but he could make very sure that if Gideon did marry, it would be someone harmless, someone who moved slowly, who came with complications, who would take years to produce a son, even if she managed it at all. Someone, in other words, exactly like Lady Rosalind Vane. Rosalind was 29, recently widowed, and terrified in a way that never showed on her carefully composed face. Her late husband had gambled away most of what should have been her security, leaving her with a title, a wardrobe society still admired, and very little else. She had one asset left that mattered. She was, by every measure London cared about, an excellent match for a duke, in need of connections and calm respectability. She did not love Gideon Ashworth. She barely knew him. But she understood, with the clear eyes of a woman who has learned exactly how little the world protects widows without money, that becoming a duchess was the only door standing between her and a very small, very frightening future. Reginald encouraged the match with a warmth that Rosalind mistook, for a time, for genuine friendship. He praised her to Gideon's mother. He arranged for her to be invited to house parties where Gideon would be present. What he did not tell her, what he was careful never to tell her, was that he was not truly hoping she would succeed. A slow courtship that dragged on for a year or two, full of polite dinners and careful letters, suited Reginald far better than an actual marriage. Every month Gideon spent undecided was a month Reginald's creditors stayed patient. He simply had not counted on a governess. The Dowager Duchess Beatrice was the first to notice it, not the love itself, which even she did not suspect yet, but the change in her son. She noticed that Gideon had begun coming down to breakfast instead of taking it in his study. She noticed that he had started asking, almost shyly, what Sophia had learned that week, as though the answer genuinely delighted him. And when she found him one evening standing outside the nursery door, simply listening to the sound of his daughter's governess reading aloud in a low, warm voice, she felt something twist in her chest that was equal parts hope and dread. Hope, because she had feared her son might never feel anything again. Dread, because she knew, better than anyone, exactly how much the family needed money it did not have, and exactly how little a penniless governess could offer a dukedom already drowning in debt. She is a good influence on Sophia, Beatrice said carefully, one evening in early spring, watching her son not quite listen to her over dinner. No one could argue that. No, Gideon agreed. No one could. But you understand, his mother went on, choosing her words the way a woman chooses stepping stones across a river she does not trust, that admiration for a governess, however well earned, cannot become anything more than admiration. Ravensmere cannot survive another year of the roof repairs alone, Gideon. The tenant cottages need rebuilding after the flooding. Your brother's debts to the Cartwright Bank are still not fully settled. We need a marriage that brings something with it besides good character. Gideon did not argue with her. That was, in some ways, the most telling thing of all. The old Gideon, before his wife's death, would have argued. This Gideon simply nodded, and said nothing, and went upstairs later that night to stand outside a nursery door he had no good reason to be standing outside of, and told himself, as he had told himself for 11 months, that he was only checking on his daughter. He was not checking on his daughter. He was listening for a voice that had somehow become the only thing in his house that still sounded like warmth. Lady Rosalind arrived at Ravensmere Hall for a fortnight's visit in the middle of May, when the gardens were at their fullest and the Dowager Duchess had arranged, with the precision of a general planning a campaign, for as many opportunities as possible for her son and his guest to be thrown together. There were walks through the rose garden. There was an evening of cards. There was a picnic by the river that Beatrice organized with a determination that made even the servants exchange knowing glances. Clara watched all of it from the edges, the way governesses are trained to watch everything. Present, useful, invisible. She told herself, walking Sophia through the kitchen garden while Rosalind's laughter drifted over from the terrace, that it was none of her concern who the Duke married. She told herself this several times a day, with the same firm patience she used when Sophia refused to eat her vegetables, and it worked about as well. It was Sophia, in the end, who said the thing Clara would never have allowed herself to say aloud. "I don't like her," the little girl announced one afternoon, watching Rosalind from the nursery window as she strolled the garden below in a pale green dress that suited her perfectly. "She smiles with her mouth, but not her eyes. You smile with your eyes, Miss Whitfield." Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and busied herself with a stack of drawing paper, until the strange tightness in her throat eased. Reginald arrived a week into Rosalind's visit, ostensibly to discuss estate matters with his cousin, though he spent a great deal more time observing than discussing. He was good at observing. It was, in many ways, his greatest talent. And what he observed, within 2 days, alarmed him considerably more than anything Rosalind's courtship had managed to achieve in a month. He observed a duke who lit up, faintly but unmistakably, whenever a certain governess entered a room. He observed a governess who blushed, just slightly, whenever that duke addressed her directly. And he observed, on the evening of the picnic, a moment by the riverbank that no one else seemed to notice, Gideon, reaching out to steady Clara as she stepped over a tree root, his hand lingering on her arm, half a second longer than balance required, and the look that passed between them, before either remembered themselves and stepped apart. Reginald did not sleep well that night. A duke infatuated with a governess was not, on its own, a threat. Infatuations faded, servants were dismissed, order was restored. But a duke who looked at a woman the way Gideon had looked at Clara Whitfield by that riverbank was a duke who might, given enough time, do something reckless enough to actually marry her. And a duke married to a woman with nothing, No fortune, no connections, nothing to slow down the arrival of children, was a duke who might have a son within the year. Reginald could not allow that. He simply could not. He did not act immediately. He was not a fool, and fools were the only sort of men who acted immediately. Instead, he watched, and waited, and began, very quietly, to lay the groundwork for a problem that would not appear to have his fingerprints anywhere on it. The opportunity came 3 weeks later, in the form of a housemaid named Peg, who had worked at Ravensmere Hall for 6 years, and who owed a debt of her own, not money, but a secret Reginald had uncovered almost by accident, involving a sweetheart in the village, and a broken promise that would have cost the girl her position if it ever reached the housekeeper's ears. Reginald did not threaten her outright. He was too clever for anything so crude. He simply mentioned, in passing, how unfortunate it would be if certain things came to light, and then asked, as though it were the smallest favor in the world, whether Peg might happen to notice, and mention, discreetly, to the right people, if Miss Whitfield ever behaved in any way that seemed less than perfectly proper. He did not need Peg to lie. He only needed her to watch, and to talk, and to let a small, true thing grow large and untrue in the telling. The small, true thing, when it came, was almost nothing at all. On a warm evening near the end of May, Gideon found Clara alone in the library, returning a book Sophia had borrowed, and for the first time in 11 months, neither of them managed to keep the conversation where it was supposed to stay. "You should know," Gideon said, more roughly than he intended, "that I have thought of very little besides you, since the day you arrived in this house." Clara's breath caught. "Your Grace, I know what I am supposed to say to you. I know what my mother wishes me to do, and what this family requires, and I have said none of it, because for 11 months, I have been a coward about the only thing that has made me feel like a man capable of happiness since my wife died." He stepped closer. "Clara, tell me I am imagining what I believe I see in your face when you look at me, and I will never speak of this again." She could have lied. It would have been the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing that protected a family already clinging to its last shreds of respectability. Instead, she said, very quietly, "You are not imagining it." Peg was passing the library door at exactly that moment, on an errand that would later prove to have been suggested to her, very casually, by a cousin of the family who happened to know precisely when the Duke intended to be there. She saw nothing improper. She heard only 2 sentences, and neither of them, taken alone, would have damaged anyone's reputation. But 2 sentences, repeated to Reginald that same night, and reshaped by him into something considerably more scandalous, before he ever repeated them to anyone else, became the seed of a story that would follow Clara Whitfield for months. Gideon did not learn of Peg's report until several days later, when his mother came to him, white-faced with what she had heard second-hand from a friend in the village. A story, already twisted through 3 tellings, of the governess meeting the Duke alone at night, of whispered promises, of a scandal that would ruin not only Clara's prospects but Sophia's, should society decide the Ashworth household could not be trusted with a young girl's reputation. Gideon knew, with total certainty, that nothing improper had happened, but he also knew, with the same certainty, that the truth of a private moment rarely survives contact with a household full of servants and a village hungry for gossip. And staring at his mother's frightened face across the study that morning, weighing his own feelings against his daughter's future, and an estate that could not survive one more scandal on top of its debts, Gideon Ashworth made the decision that would define the rest of this story. He sent for Clara. She came to the study already knowing, from the look on the housekeeper's face, that something had gone terribly wrong. "I cannot marry a governess," Gideon said, before she had fully closed the door, forcing the words out fast, as though speed might make them hurt less. "Whatever I said in the library, whatever you believe grew between us this year, it cannot become anything more than what it was permitted to be. There are rumors already circling about that evening. If I do not end this now, cleanly, you will be the one who suffers for it, not I. You will lose every reference, every future position, everything your family has left. I will not let that happen to you, because of my own selfishness." "Selfishness," Clara repeated, very quietly. "Is that what you call it?" "I call it the truth." Ravensmere needs a marriage that saves this family, not one that ruins the last good name you have left. You deserve better than to be the scandal that finishes what your father's court-martial started. It was, in its own terrible way, an act of protection. Gideon believed every word of it. He believed it so completely that he did not see, standing 3 feet away from him, the exact moment something in Clara Whitfield's expression closed like a door being locked from the inside. "Then I will save you the trouble of dismissing me," she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything else in her wanted to. "I will be gone by morning." She kept her word. By the time the sun rose over Ravensmere Hall the next day, Clara Whitfield was already 3 miles down the road, sitting very straight in a hired carriage, staring at nothing, while behind her, a 5-year-old girl cried for a governess no one had explained had left, and a duke stood alone at his study window, watching the road long after the carriage had disappeared, already beginning to understand that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Clara did not go far, at first, only to her brother's school in York, where she paid a visit that emptied nearly the last of her savings, and left her staring at a ledger with no entries under future income. Thomas was 14, quiet and clever in the way boys become when they have learned early that the world does not owe them softness, and he did not ask his sister why her eyes were red when she arrived. He simply held her hand across the visitor's table and told her, with the blunt confidence of a younger brother who believes his sister capable of anything, that she would find another position within the month. It took closer to 6 weeks, and it was not luck that found it for her, but a chance meeting at a church service in York, with an elderly woman named Lady Eugenia Hartwell, who was looking for a companion to help manage her correspondence and her considerable library, and who took an immediate, fierce liking to the composed young woman with the careful hands and the sad eyes who had, she was told, once been governess to a duke's daughter. Lady Eugenia did not ask why Clara had left that position. She had lived 70 years in society, and had learned, long ago, that the questions people avoid answering are usually the ones that matter least to whether they can be trusted. She hired Clara within the week, and by the end of July, Clara Whitfield was settled in a smaller but comfortable house 2 counties away from Ravensmere Hall, cataloguing a library, answering letters, and trying, with only partial success, not to think about a 5-year-old girl who had likely stopped asking why her governess never said goodbye. The rumor found her anyway. The way rumors nurtured by a determined man always seem to travel faster than the people they damage. It arrived at Lady Eugenia's house in August, carried by a visiting cousin who had heard, third or fourth hand, a version of the story that had grown considerably more scandalous with each retelling. A governess dismissed from a duke's household, under circumstances no one could quite specify. The cousin repeated it at tea, brightly, without any particular malice, the way people repeat interesting gossip, without ever considering the person it might be about, is standing 3 feet away holding a teapot. Clara's hands did not shake as she poured, though it cost her a considerable effort of will. She said nothing in her own defense. She had learned, over the course of one terrible spring, that defending yourself against a rumor you cannot fully explain only ever seems to feed it further. It was Lady Eugenia who defended her, with a fierceness that surprised the entire drawing-room and settled the matter permanently within her household. "Miss Whitfield," the old woman said, in a voice that had silenced far grander company than a gossiping cousin, "has run my correspondence and my library with more honesty and competence than any companion I have employed in 30 years. I have not the slightest interest in second-hand stories about a household I have never visited, told by people who were not present for whatever truly happened there. If you wish to continue as my guest, you will not repeat that particular story under my roof again." The cousin, suitably chastened, did not. But the story did not disappear entirely. It simply went quiet, the way a fire goes quiet under wet leaves, still smoldering somewhere out of sight, waiting for a dry season to flare again. Clara understood, with a clarity that settled cold in her stomach, that her reputation would likely never be fully clean again unless the truth of what had actually happened at Ravensmere Hall came out. And she had no way of knowing, from 2 counties away, that a duke was already beginning, however slowly, to suspect the same thing. It was at Lady Eugenia's house, in the first week of September, that Clara met Lord Julian Hartwell. Julian was Eugenia's great-nephew, 30 years old, recently returned from 2 years abroad settling family business in the West Indies, and entirely unprepared for the effect of finding a serious, sharp-witted young woman running his great-aunt's household with an efficiency that put his own steward to shame. He was, by every measure society cared about, an excellent man, not wealthy in the staggering way a duke was wealthy, but comfortable, well-regarded, kind to his tenants, and entirely without the complicated grief that had made Gideon Ashworth such a difficult man to love. He made Clara laugh within their first conversation, over a disagreement about whether a particular Latin translation in Eugenia's library had been done badly, or simply differently, and he was honest enough with himself to notice, within a month, that he was arranging far more excuses to visit his aunt than any dutiful nephew required. He did not rush her. That was, perhaps, the thing that made him dangerous to Gideon's cause without either man ever meeting. Julian Hartwell had the patience of a man who had never once had his heart broken, and he courted Clara the way a careful gardener tends something he suspects is fragile, slowly, attentively, never forcing a single bloom before its season. He asked about her family, and listened, really listened, when she told him about her father. He asked about her time as a governess, and did not press when she gave him only careful, incomplete answers about why she had left. By November he had not yet declared himself, but everyone in Lady Eugenia's household, including Lady Eugenia herself, understood perfectly well what was building between them. Meanwhile, at Ravensmere Hall, Gideon Ashworth was learning that grief for a woman still living is a strange and particular kind of suffering. He had expected, in some vague way, that time would dull it. Instead, the opposite happened. Sophia's questions about when Miss Whitfield is coming back grew less frequent, but sharper, more pointed, until one evening in October, she asked her father directly, with the devastating clarity only children possess, "Did you make her go away because you didn't love her, or because you did?" Gideon did not have an answer he was willing to give a 5-year-old. He threw himself into estate business instead, the way men of his class had always been permitted to disappear into duty rather than feeling. He met with his solicitor, a careful, thorough man named Mr. Corbin, about the tenant cottages and the roof repairs, and the debts his brother had left behind. And it was in one of those meetings, in late October, that the first thread of the true story began, quite by accident, to come loose. "I've had an odd request from Mr. Ashworth's man of business," Corbin mentioned, almost as an aside, while reviewing the household accounts, asking after the terms of the succession trust, specifically, what happens to certain protections should your grace remarry and produce an heir before Mr. Ashworth's own debts to certain parties are settled. It struck me as an unusual thing for him to be so precise about. Gideon had not thought much of it at the time. He had too much else occupying his mind, namely, the fact that Lady Rosalind, whose courtship had continued through the autumn with a patience that was beginning to feel less like romance and more like a siege, had started dropping increasingly direct hints about an understanding between them, hints his mother encouraged, with a warmth that made Gideon feel, more and more, like an asset being carefully managed, rather than a man being loved. It was Rosalind herself, oddly enough, who gave him the second thread. She came to him in November, in a rare unguarded moment after a dinner, where Beatrice had all but announced an engagement that did not yet exist, and said something that surprised them both. "You are still thinking of her," she said. Not an accusation, something closer to exhaustion. The governess. Everyone in this house still tiptoes around her name as though she died rather than left. "I did not think it was so obvious," Gideon admitted. "It is obvious to everyone except your mother, who wishes very much not to see it." Rosalind studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her composed face. "For what it's worth, Your Grace, I never asked anyone to spread stories about her departure. I know what people believe I did. I did not do it. I would like you to know that, whatever else you think of me." It was the first time anyone had suggested to Gideon that the rumors following Clara might not have originated where everyone, including Gideon himself, had quietly assumed. He did not yet know where to look instead. But for the first time in 5 months, he began, very carefully, to ask. The investigation that followed took longer than Gideon would have liked, and every delay taught him something about how differently the world moves when you are trying to uncover a secret instead of simply live your life. He wrote to Mr. Corbin asking for a fuller accounting of Reginald's finances, and the reply, when it finally came after the better part of a week, letters between Yorkshire and London being what they were, 3 or 4 days each way, longer if weather turned the roads to mud, revealed debts far larger than Gideon had ever suspected his cousin capable of accumulating. He wrote to acquaintances in London, carefully, without revealing why he asked, and received back a slow trickle of information about moneylenders growing impatient, about a man living increasingly beyond means that made no sense unless he was borrowing heavily against something he did not yet possess. Letters alone were not enough. In the last week of November, Gideon made the 3-day journey to London himself, leaving Sophia in his mother's care, with instructions that troubled Beatrice considerably more than he was willing to explain. He spent 2 days there, moving quietly through rooms he normally avoided, the offices of solicitors who handled unpleasant business discreetly, a coffee house, near the Exchange, where men who lent money to desperate gentlemen were known to conduct their real business over cards. It was in that coffee house, over an excruciating hour of careful, indirect conversation with a lender named Mr. Fenshaw, that Gideon finally heard, stated plainly by a man with no particular loyalty to Reginald, and every incentive to be honest with a duke asking pointed questions, exactly how large his cousin's debts had grown, and exactly how precisely those debts depended on Gideon remaining unmarried. Your cousin has borrowed considerably against expectations that are, forgive me, your grace, entirely contingent on your continued good health and continued bachelorhood, Fenshaw said, with the flat honesty of a man who had long ago stopped being embarrassed by the nature of his profession. I confess, I had begun to wonder, these last months, whether he might take rather more active steps to protect that arrangement than a patient man ought to need to. Gideon returned to Yorkshire 3 days later, with confirmation of motive, though not yet proof of the act itself. That proof, when it finally came, would arrive not from London at all, but from his own housekeeper, sitting across a servants' hall table from a frightened housemaid who had been carrying her guilt for the better part of half a year. It was Mrs. Hale, the housekeeper at Ravensmere, who finally gave him the peace he needed, and she did it not because anyone asked her to, but because she had watched Peg grow thinner and more anxious through the autumn, flinching at every mention of the previous spring, and a housekeeper, who has run a great house for 20 years, develops an instinct for guilt that no amount of careful composure can fully hide. She did not accuse Peg outright. She simply sat the girl down one evening in the servants' hall, poured her a cup of tea she did not ask her to drink, and said gently that whatever trouble Peg had gotten herself into, it would go easier for her if she told the truth before someone else told it for her. I never meant for it to grow so large, Mrs. Hale, Peg said, twisting her apron between her hands until the fabric threatened to tear. Mr. Ashworth only asked me to watch, and to mention things, small things, true things, to people in the village. I didn't lie, not at first. I only said what I'd truly seen and heard. But he'd take what I told him and hand it back to me changed, worse, and ask me to repeat it just so, to this person and that. And when I hesitated, he'd remind me, gently, always so gently, that he knew about Danny Coombs and me, and what my mother would say if the housekeeper ever heard of it. She wiped her eyes with the back of one reddened hand. I told myself Miss Whitfield would never truly suffer for it. Gentry find their feet again, I told myself. I didn't understand, not truly, how far a story travels once you've let it out of your hands. You understand it now, Mrs. Hale said, not unkindly, though her voice had gone very steady in the way it did when she meant to be obeyed. And you will tell His Grace everything you have just told me, word for word, tomorrow morning. Whatever Mr. Ashworth threatened you with, girl, I promise you a duke's fury at the truth is a far gentler thing to weather than his fury at discovering it was kept from him. Peg broke down within minutes of repeating it all to Gideon the following day, and did not stop shaking until well after she had finished. The full account, once Gideon heard it from his housekeeper's careful retelling, was worse than he had imagined and, in its way, a relief. Worse, because it confirmed that the moment in the library had been deliberately watched and deliberately twisted. A relief, because it meant that Clara had done nothing wrong at all, that every ounce of scandal attached to her name had been manufactured by a man protecting his own inheritance. Gideon's first instinct was fury, the kind of cold, controlled fury that frightened his household more than shouting ever could have. His second instinct, arriving close on the heels of the first, was something closer to despair, because knowing the truth now, in December, 7 months after he had sent Clara away, did not undo the 7 months. It did not undo the letters he had never written her, the pride that had kept him silent even after doubt began creeping in, the fact that somewhere 2 counties away, a good man named Lord Julian Hartwell had spent an entire autumn quietly, patiently, honorably falling in love with the woman Gideon had thrown away. He might have acted immediately, if not for what happened next. Sophia fell ill in the 2nd week of December, quickly and frighteningly, the way childhood fevers sometimes do, well at breakfast, listless by afternoon, burning by nightfall, with a heat that made the physician's face go carefully, professionally blank, in the way that terrifies parents far more than any words could. It was influenza, complicated by the damp Yorkshire winter, and for 3 days Gideon did not leave his daughter's bedside, did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch, did not think about Reginald or Rosalind or debts or dukedoms at all, thought only of the small, too still shape under the blankets, and the sound of her breathing, which he had never in his life listened to so closely. Beatrice sat with him through the worst of the first night, the 2 of them saying very little, both of them remembering, without needing to say so aloud, another sickbed few years earlier that had ended very differently. "You did not lose her mother because you loved her too little, Gideon," his mother said quietly, somewhere near 2 in the morning, watching her son's face in the candlelight. "I know you have always secretly believed some version of that. You did not lose Clara because you loved her too much either. Both times, you lost something because you were too frightened of losing everything else to hold on to the thing that mattered most. I would very much like you to consider, whatever happens with this fever, not making that particular mistake a 3rd time." Gideon did not answer her. He did not need to. He simply reached for his daughter's small hot hand again, and held on, and did not let go until dawn. By the 2nd night, Sophia had grown quiet in a way that frightened Gideon more than her earlier restlessness had, no longer thrashing against the heat, simply lying very still, her breath shallow and quick, murmuring names and half-formed words that made no sense to anyone but seemed, somehow, urgently important to her. It was somewhere in that long, terrible stretch of hours, listening to his daughter murmur for a mother she barely remembered, and a governess no one had explained had left, that Gideon Ashworth understood, with a clarity that felt almost like physical pain, exactly how much of his careful, dutiful, ducal composure he was willing to burn to the ground for one more chance to make things right. It was in the depth of that terror, on the 2nd night, half out of his mind with exhaustion and fear, that Gideon did something he would later be unable to fully explain, except to say that some part of him had simply stopped being able to bear it alone. He sent a rider, not a letter, a rider, on the fastest horse in the stable, twice as swift as any coach, south toward the county where Lady Eugenia Hartwell's house stood, carrying nothing but a single desperate line. "Sophia is gravely ill, and asks for you. I have no right to ask this. I am asking anyway." It was not entirely honest. Sophia, in her fever, had asked for many things. Her mother, whom she barely remembered, a particular blue ribbon, water, and only once, in a half-conscious murmur that Gideon chose, in that moment, to hear as more significant than it likely was, had she said a name that sounded enough like Miss Whitfield, for a desperate father to build a rider's entire journey on. The letter reached Clara on a Thursday evening, delivered into a household already tense with an entirely different kind of anticipation. Julian had asked Lady Eugenia's permission to propose the following week, at a small dinner planned to mark his aunt's birthday. Everyone in the house except Clara herself seemed to know it was coming. Lady Eugenia had all but told her outright, beaming with the particular satisfaction of an old woman who believes she has successfully arranged the happiness of 2 people she loves. Clara had spent the better part of a month turning the prospect over in her mind, with the careful, exhausted practicality of a woman who has learned not to trust her own heart with important decisions. Julian was good. Julian was kind. Julian would give her a settled, safe, respectable life, and would never once make her feel like a scandal waiting to happen. She had very nearly convinced herself that this, steady, sensible, earned affection built slowly over months rather than the reckless, consuming feeling she had once let herself have for a man who could never have her, was not a lesser kind of happiness, only a wiser one. She wrote to Thomas about it, 3 days before the rider arrived from Ravensmere, in the closest thing to an honest confession she allowed herself on paper. "I believe Lord Hartwell intends to ask me something important very soon," she wrote, "and I believe I intend to say yes, and I want very much for that to feel like the happy ending it ought to be. I am only ashamed to admit that some small, stubborn part of me keeps waiting for a different letter entirely, one that will never come, from a man who made his choice a long time ago, and made it, I think, honestly, however much it cost us both. I am nearly ready to stop waiting for it. Truly, Thomas, I am almost there." She sealed the letter, gave it to a servant to post the next morning, and told herself, with the particular firmness of a woman trying very hard to believe her own words, that almost there was close enough to build a life on. The rider from Ravensmere arrived the following evening, before her letter to Thomas had even reached the mail coach to York, and every careful, sensible sentence she had written about being almost there dissolved the instant she read Gideon's desperate line about Sophia asking for her. She was still turning it over in her mind when the rider's message reached her, mud-spattered and breathless from a journey covered in barely a day and a half of hard riding, and every careful, sensible thought in her head scattered like startled birds. She did not stop to weigh the wisdom of it. She did not stop to consider what it would mean for Julian, or for the dinner planned in 5 days' time, or for the reputation she had worked 7 months to quietly rebuild. She simply asked Lady Eugenia for the use of a carriage, packed a single case with the same speed she had once packed to leave Ravensmere Hall, and was on the road south before the household had fully understood what was happening. Julian found out only after she had already gone, from his aunt, who delivered the news with the careful gentleness of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize heartbreak arriving before it fully lands. "She has gone to the Duke's daughter," Eugenia said. "The child is ill." Julian said nothing for a long moment, standing very still in his aunt's drawing room, with a small velvet box he had been carrying in his coat pocket for the better part of a week. Then he said, quietly, in the voice of a man discovering something he had perhaps always known and never let himself examine, "She never once, in 4 months, spoke his name without her whole face changing." He did not follow her. That too would matter later, the choice a decent man made in a single quiet moment, to let the woman he loved go toward the thing she truly wanted, rather than chase her back toward the life he wished she wanted instead. Clara reached Ravensmere Hall a little before midnight on the second day, exhausted, travel-stained, and shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with the December air. Mrs. Hale met her at the door with an expression of such open relief that Clara understood, before a single word was spoken, how frightened the household truly was. "She's asking for you," the housekeeper said, already leading her up the stairs. "Been asking on and off since the fever turned worse this afternoon. His Grace hasn't left her side in 3 days. Hardly eaten. We've been half afraid for him as well as the child." The nursery, when Clara reached it, looked exactly as it had the last time she had seen it 7 months earlier, except for the man slumped in the chair beside the bed, unshaven, hollow-eyed, holding his daughter's small hand as though letting go might be the thing that finally lost her. He looked up when the door opened, and whatever careful composure Gideon Ashworth had maintained through 5 days of watching his daughter suffer, simply fell away. "You came," he said, and his voice broke on the second word. "Of course I came." Clara was already crossing the room, already pressing the back of her hand to Sophia's forehead, already falling into the calm, competent rhythm of a woman who had spent a year learning exactly how to care for this particular child. "How long has the fever held this high?" "Since this morning. The physician says the next night will tell us which way it turns." Clara did not leave the nursery again that night. She and Gideon sat on opposite sides of the small bed, cooling cloths and quiet murmured reassurances passing between them in the particular shorthand of 2 people who had once, very briefly, learned to work as a single unit around this child's needs. Somewhere near 3 in the morning, exhausted past the point of maintaining any careful distance, Gideon reached across the narrow space between their chairs and took Clara's hand, and she did not pull away, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing to say that would not have shattered the fragile, terrified peace of the room. The fever broke a little after dawn. It happened the way fevers sometimes do, without warning or ceremony. Sophia simply grew quiet and cooler, and her breathing evened out into the deep, ordinary sleep of a child who has finally, exhaustedly, begun to heal. The physician, summoned immediately, examined her with careful hands and pronounced, with visible relief of his own, that the worst had passed. She would need rest, and quiet, and several weeks of careful nursing, but she would recover. Gideon wept, openly, for the first time since his wife's funeral. It was only after Sophia was sleeping peacefully, and the physician had gone, and the first grey light of a Yorkshire winter morning was creeping through the nursery windows, that Gideon finally found the strength to say the thing he had been carrying, unspoken, since Peg's confession 3 weeks earlier. "I know the truth now," he said quietly. "About what happened last spring, about the library, and what was said about it, and who made sure it was heard by the wrong ears." He turned to face her fully, and Clara saw, for the first time, the full weight of what those weeks of investigation had cost him. "Reginald manufactured the scandal that drove you from this house. Peg confessed everything to Mrs. Hale 3 weeks ago. I have known for nearly a month that you did nothing wrong, that I sent away an innocent woman to protect a family name from a threat that never truly existed, and that I did it because I was too much of a coward to fight for you instead." Clara said nothing for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was very careful, the voice of a woman guarding something precious against further damage. "And what would you have done, Gideon, if Sophia had not fallen ill? If there had been no reason urgent enough to send a rider after me?" It was, he understood immediately, the only question that mattered. "I don't know," he admitted, because it was the truth, and because she deserved nothing less than the truth after everything his pride had already cost her. "I would like to believe I would have come for you, regardless. But I cannot promise you I would have found the courage in time, before you married Lord Hartwell, and I lost my chance to ever ask." He held her gaze, unflinching, though everything in him wanted to look away from what he might see there. "I am not asking you to forgive 7 months in a single night, Clara. I am only asking you not to leave again before I have had the chance to try to earn it back." Whatever Clara might have said in answer was interrupted by the sound of a carriage arriving in the courtyard below, considerably earlier than any visitor had any business calling, and considerably more urgently than good manners generally permitted. It was Reginald. He had not come to Ravensmere Hall out of concern for his young cousin's health, though he made a passable show of it in the entrance hall, inquiring after Sophia with an expression of practiced sympathy. He had come because word had reached him, through channels considerably faster than Gideon realized existed, that Peg had confessed everything to Mrs. Hale nearly a month earlier, and that his cousin had spent weeks quietly gathering proof of exactly what Reginald had done. A man with debts as large as Reginald's, and creditors as impatient, could not afford to wait passively for a confrontation. He had come to control it instead. He found Gideon in the study, the same study where, 7 months earlier, Gideon had sent Clara away, and he found Clara there as well, standing beside the Duke rather than behind him, which told Reginald, in a single glance, that whatever he had hoped to salvage from this visit was already considerably more difficult than he had planned for. "Cousin," Reginald said, with a warmth that did not reach his eyes, "I came the moment I heard about Sophia. Thank God she's recovering." "Sit down, Reginald," Gideon said, and something in his voice made it very clear this was not a request. What followed was not shouting. Gideon had imagined, during the long nights of his investigation, that this confrontation would come as fury, that he would finally unleash 7 months of grief and anger onto the man who had engineered it. Instead, faced with his cousin's carefully composed face, across the same desk where he had once made the worst decision of his life, Gideon found himself simply, devastatingly calm. "I know about the debts," he said. "I know about the moneylenders in London, growing impatient for their return on your expectations. I know that a housemaid named Peg planted a story about Miss Whitfield's conduct in this house at your direction, because you understood that a duke besotted with a governess might do something reckless enough to marry her and produce an heir before your creditors lost patience with you entirely." He let the silence stretch, watching every flicker of his cousin's expression. "What I do not yet know, Reginald, is whether you intend to confess all of this to my mother yourself, or whether I will need to summon Mrs. Hale and Peg both to say it for you." Reginald's composure did not crack all at once. It happened slowly, the way ice gives way beneath weight. It was never built to hold. First a tightening around his eyes, then a stiffness in his shoulders, and finally, when he understood there was truly no argument left to make, a kind of exhausted collapse into the chair Gideon had offered him. "I never wished you harm," he said quietly, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something in his voice sounded almost honest. "I only wished for time. My creditors would have ruined me the moment you had a son, Gideon. Do you understand what that means for a man? To know your entire future depends on another man's misfortune, and to hate yourself for wanting it, and to want it anyway because the alternative is debtor's prison." "I understand it well enough to pity you," Gideon said. "I do not understand it well enough to forgive what you did to an innocent woman to protect yourself." It was Lady Rosalind, arriving unannounced not an hour later. Drawn, she would explain, by the same news of Sophia's illness that had brought Reginald, who delivered the final piece neither Gideon nor Clara had expected. She had come, in truth, half hoping to salvage what remained of an understanding with Gideon that she suspected, correctly, was already lost. What she found instead, standing in the hallway outside the study and catching fragments of the conversation within, was confirmation of something she had begun quietly suspecting for months. That Reginald Ashworth had used her ambitions the same way he had used Peg's fear, as a tool in a scheme that had never once considered her own happiness at all. She did not confront him gently. "You told me," she said, sweeping into the study with a fury that startled everyone present, "that encouraging my courtship of the Duke was simple kindness between friends. You let me believe, for the better part of a year, that you wished me well. And all the while you were counting on my courtship dragging on slowly enough to buy you time with your creditors, never once caring whether it succeeded, only that it never resolved too quickly." Her voice cracked, not with sorrow but with a rage that had clearly been building far longer than this single morning. "I have spent a year making myself small and patient and agreeable for a man who was never truly available to me, because you told me it would work if I only waited. You used me, Reginald, precisely as ruthlessly as you used that poor girl. It was, in its own bitter way, the thing that finally undid Reginald Ashworth's last hope of salvaging any part of his position in the family." Facing not one furious accuser but two, with a housemaid's confession already recorded and a housekeeper willing to testify to it, and a widow with nothing left to lose now willing to tell all of society exactly how she had been manipulated, he had no cards left to play. He left Ravensmere Hall within the hour, and left the country within the month, his creditors closing in from every direction, the moment word of his failed scheme began, inevitably, to spread through the same social circles he had spent years cultivating. He was never formally prosecuted. The family, for its own sake, chose quiet disgrace over public scandal, but he never set foot in Yorkshire again, and the title of heir presumptive passed, in the fullness of time, to a far more distant, and far less ambitious cousin, who wanted nothing more from the Ashworth family than to be left alone. Lady Rosalind did not stay in Yorkshire either, though her departure was considerably more dignified. She wrote to Gideon a brief, gracious letter some weeks later, wishing him happiness with a sincerity that surprised him, and word reached Ravensmere Hall the following autumn that she had married a widowed baron in Kent, a quiet, kind man of modest but sufficient means, who valued her sharp mind rather than merely her usefulness to his ambitions. It was not the future she had once planned for herself. By every account that reached the Ashworth family afterward, it was a considerably happier one. With Reginald gone, and the truth laid bare before the entire household, Gideon might have expected the path back to Clara to feel simple. It did not. Trust, he was learning, was not restored merely because its enemy had been exposed. Clara stayed at Ravensmere Hall through the following week, nursing Sophia back to full strength with the same quiet devotion she had always shown the child, but she kept a careful, deliberate distance from Gideon himself. Polite, warm even, but guarded in a way that told him plainly this was not yet a reconciliation. It was only a truce. "You cannot simply announce the truth and expect 7 months to disappear," she told him one evening, when he finally found the courage to ask why she still hesitated. They were in the small sitting room, adjoining the nursery, Sophia asleep at last down the hall, the house quiet around them, in the particular way old houses grow quiet in winter. I do not doubt any longer that you love me, Gideon. I never truly doubted it, even in the study that morning. I only doubted whether it would ever be enough to outweigh everything else you believed you owed this family. And now? Now I need to know it will be enough. The next time something frightens you, because something will. A duke's life is never short of reasons to be afraid. Debts, scandal, society's opinion, all the things that convinced you once already that loving me was a luxury this family could not afford. She met his eyes steadily. I will not spend my life waiting to discover, at the first sign of real difficulty, that I am expendable again. It was, Gideon understood, an entirely fair thing to ask of him, and so, rather than arguing or pleading, he did the only thing he could think of that might actually answer her. He showed her, over the following weeks, rather than simply telling her. He wrote, himself, to Mr. Corbin, instructing that the estate's finances be restructured not around a marriage that might rescue them, but around a genuine plan of recovery. The sale of a smaller, less essential property in Northumberland that his father had held largely for prestige rather than income, the careful renegotiation of terms with the bank that held his brother's old debts, a slower but sturdier path back to solvency that did not depend on anyone marrying for money at all. He told his mother, plainly and without apology, that whatever match he eventually made would be made for love, or not made at all, and that if the dukedom's survival truly depended on nothing else, then he would rather see it survive honestly diminished than dishonestly saved. Beatrice, to her credit, did not argue for long. She had watched her son grieve for 2 years after his wife's death, and had watched him come alive again, however briefly, during the 11 months Clara Whitfield lived under her roof, and some quiet, unspoken part of her had known for a long time which outcome she truly wanted for him, whatever practical fears had kept her from admitting it. She went to Clara herself, in January, in a conversation that cost the proud old Duchess considerably more than she let show on her face. "I want you to know," Beatrice said, standing rather stiffly in the doorway of the small sitting room where Clara had taken to spending her evenings, "that I encouraged Lady Rosalind's courtship, because I believed, quite genuinely, that I was protecting this family. I did not understand, until I very nearly lost my granddaughter and watched my son come apart at her bedside, that I had been protecting the wrong thing entirely." She paused, and something in her carefully composed expression softened into an honesty Clara had never seen from her before. "I am asking your forgiveness, Miss Whitfield, not on my son's behalf, on my own. I was unkind to you in ways I told myself, at the time, were merely practical." "You were protecting your family, Your Grace," Clara said quietly. "I have never once resented you for that, however much it cost me." "That is a more generous answer than I deserve." Beatrice hesitated, then added, with the particular awkwardness of a woman unused to expressing warmth directly, "Sophia has not laughed so freely since her mother died, as she has since you returned to this house. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I have stopped caring a great deal what the dowry ledger says about that." It was not quite an apology in the fullest sense, and Clara did not expect it to be. Beatrice Ashworth was not a woman built for full apologies. But it was, in its own careful way, an opened door, and Clara understood, walking away from that conversation, that whatever Gideon eventually asked of her, she would not be entering his family as an outsider still fighting for her place in it. "She makes Sophia laugh," Beatrice said simply, one evening in January, watching Clara through the drawing-room window, as she walked Sophia across the frost-hardened lawn, both of them bundled against the cold, both of them, unmistakably, happy. "I have decided that is worth more to this family than any dowry I once imagined we needed." It took until February, 6 full weeks of slow, deliberate rebuilding, of Gideon proving through small daily choices rather than grand declarations that he had truly changed, before Clara finally allowed herself to believe it completely. The proposal, when it came, was nothing like the desperate confession in the library the previous spring. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in the kitchen garden where Clara had once walked Sophia past a laughing Lady Rosalind, with no audience but a robin working at the half-frozen ground and Sophia herself, watching solemnly from a nearby bench with the enormous satisfaction of a 5-year-old who has correctly predicted an adult decision months in advance. "I am not offering you rescue this time," Gideon said, kneeling in the cold, damp earth without any apparent concern for his trousers. "I am not offering you a solution to a scandal, or a favor I owe you, or anything so small as gratitude for what you did for my daughter. I am asking you, plainly, as a man who has spent 7 months learning exactly how much he does not want to live without you, whether you will marry me, not because it saves anything, but simply because I love you, and because I believe, if you will let me prove it every day for the rest of our lives, that I can finally be the man who deserves to. Clara laughed, a real laugh, bright and startled and entirely unguarded, and said yes before he had even fully finished rising from the ground. They did not marry quickly. Bans had to be read, the traditional weeks of public notice observed properly in both their parishes, and Gideon insisted, over his mother's mild objection, on a full spring engagement, rather than a rushed winter wedding, wanting Clara to enter their marriage as his intended bride, in the fullest public sense, courted openly, and without a single whisper of the shame that had once driven her from his house. Word of the engagement reached London by March, and society, ever hungry for a story more interesting than mere scandal, found itself considerably more charmed by a duke who had chosen love over an advantageous match than it had ever been alarmed by rumors of a governess's supposed impropriety. Rosalind's own graceful remarriage that same season, and Reginald's quiet, thorough disgrace, did the rest of the work of rehabilitating Clara's reputation entirely. They were married in May, almost exactly a year after the evening in the library that had first cost them everything, in the small stone church nearest Ravensmere Hall, with the hawthorn hedges along the lane blooming white in a way the local vicar assured them was unusually early, and unusually beautiful, for the season. Sophia, 6 years old by then, and utterly convinced she had personally arranged the entire match through sheer force of will, walked ahead of Clara, down the aisle scattering rose petals with the fierce concentration of a child who understands she has been given an important job. Lord Julian Hartwell was not present at the wedding, though he sent, some weeks later, a brief and genuinely warm letter of congratulations that Clara kept, quietly, in the same drawer where she kept her father's old naval commendations. Not out of any lingering affection beyond friendship, but out of gratitude for a decent man who had loved her honestly, and had let her go just as honestly when he understood her heart belonged elsewhere. He married, 2 years later, a clergyman's daughter from Hampshire, by all accounts a lively, warm-hearted woman, who suited him considerably better than a governess, still quietly in love with someone else ever could have. The estate recovered slowly, the way estates genuinely do, not in a season, not through any single stroke of fortune, but through a full year of careful management, of tenant cottages rebuilt one by one as funds allowed, of fields that produced a modest but honest harvest that first autumn, and a considerably better one the autumn after. By the time Clara gave birth to a son 2 years into their marriage, a small, loud, entirely healthy boy, the household immediately and unanimously declared to have his mother's steady eyes and his father's stubborn chin. The moneylenders who had once circled Reginald's expectations had long since given up any hope of a dukedom in disarray, and Ravensmere Hall stood, for the first time in a generation, on ground that was genuinely, unglamorously solid. Sophia grew into a young woman who remembered, all her life, a particular winter when her father had wept with relief at her bedside and her governess had come racing home through the cold to sit beside her, and though she was too young that December to understand everything that had passed between the two adults she loved most in the world, she understood, even then, the one thing that mattered. Years later, long after Sophia had grown and married and had children of her own, she found among her father's papers a single letter he had kept for the whole of his life, folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, the letter announcing, all those years ago, that Miss Clara Whitfield was being courted by a lord of good name and easy fortune. Gideon had never explained to her why he kept it, and by the time she found it he was gone, and there was no one left to ask. She understood anyway. It was not kept as a wound. It was kept as a reminder of the exact morning a proud, frightened, grieving man had finally understood that the thing he was so afraid of losing was already, through his own hand, gone, and that the only honest response to that kind of fear was not caution, it was to fight. He had. That was, in the end, the whole of the story worth telling. Not that a duke rejected his governess, and not even that he grew jealous watching another man court her. It was that, given one true chance to choose differently, he did, and spent the rest of his life proving that some men, however slowly they learn it well enough to make it last. If this story moved you, You know exactly what to do. Hit that like button. It tells me you want more stories like Gideon and Clara's. Subscribe and ring the bell, because I post a brand new historical romance every single day, and you will not want to miss the next one. And I want to know, in the comments below, at what moment did you fall for this story? If you're new here, welcome. You just found your new obsession. Go check the description for more stories just like this one, and I will see you in the next video.